Welcome everyone, my name is Eugeniusz Romer, this is Układ Sił, the YouTube channel of Polish magazine about international relations. And today I'm very happy to host Professor Edward Fishman. Welcome, sir.
Thank you so much for having me on the show today.
Professor Fishman is the author of the book Chokepoints, American Power in the Age of Economic Warfare. This book was published in Poland by the publishing house Prześwity, so I strongly recommend reaching out for this book. And today we are going to discuss the insights that are included in this position. So let's start from the word that is mentioned in the title, the choke points. What are the choke points you are referring to in your book?
Sure. So historically speaking, when the word choke points would come up, it really referred to geographical features like the Strait of Hormuz or the Bosphorus, these sort of critical nodes in global trade networks where physically cutting them off could impose significant economic pressure on another country. For example, the Strait of Hormuz, you've got 20% of global oil flowing through that single narrow waterway every single day. And throughout history, cutting off those choke points was a fundamental way that economic warfare was waged. And holding the choke points was part of what gave great powers their significant heft in the world. What happened in the 1990s in the wake of hyperglobalization, when China, Russia, other former communist countries like Poland joined the international economy, they joined the dollar-based financial system, they joined global supply chains, you have the creation of these invisible choke points, these parts of the global economy where one country has a dominant position and there are few, if any, substitutes. So similar to physical choke points like the Strait of Hormuz, the dollar has become a choke point in the global economy where 90% of all foreign exchange transactions are using the dollar. China's rare earth minerals have become another very important choke point where China is producing 90% of the global supply. And then, of course, the semiconductor designs of companies like NVIDIA, which is producing 80 to 90% of the AI chips in the world, are another choke point. So what this has done is it's enabled the countries that possess these choke points, principally the US and China, but also the European Union, to cut off foreign countries and impose significant damage. And they can do this, unlike with the previous choke points, like physical ones, they can do this without the deployment of military force, just by signing documents in the White House or in the Chinese Communist Party offices in Beijing. And so it's created a whole new nonviolent form of economic coercion that has been fundamentally reshaping geopolitics for the past 2 decades. And that's really the story that I seek to tell in my book, Choke Points.
Yeah, but some people, they believe that actually the fact that the countries on Earth are interconnected, and they have their own specializations. Like, for example, you mentioned the Chinese are producing rare earth materials, the Taiwanese are producing semiconductors, the Americans are producing the architecture of those semiconductors. So this connection, those connections, they actually serve peace because the nations, they are having no incentive to fight each other because they are dependent. So do you think it still works this way?
No, and I don't think it ever did. I think that the theory that economic interdependence would cause peace actually had it the wrong way, which is that peace is what enables economic interdependence. So as I mentioned, this period of hyperglobalization where we did get to a world where we're just so deeply interdependent, right? Where we have just-in-time supply chains where our pharmaceuticals, right, critical life-saving drugs in the United States are reliant on additives from China. The way we got there was because in the 90s, after the end of the Cold War, we did not have any meaningful geopolitical competition, right? So when we created this kind of global economy, when we embraced the World Trade Organization, for instance, the US viewed China and Russia more as potential friends than adversaries, right? I mean, there was not a concern that China was ever going to weaponize rare earth minerals against the US. And China, for its part, was not worried about depending on the dollar, right? I mean, China built its entire global economic footprint on the back of the dollar, right? I mean, that's where they've amassed all of their hard currency in the dollars. They're a massive holder of US government debt. They're a massive holder of all kinds of US assets. And one of the most remarkable stats is that even though China is by far the world's biggest exporter, only 30% of its foreign trade is invoiced in its own currency. Most of its trade, the majority of its trade, is settled in dollars to this day. And so, of course, China would never have embraced such a world had they been worried about the US as a geopolitical adversary. And so the global economy we have today, Eugenios, this is a global economy that was built with a different geopolitical world in mind. It was built with the benign geopolitical environment of the 1990s in mind, not the intensifying geopolitical competition that we see in our world today.
So what's the future of global economy? Because today, for example, Reuters reported that the Chinese, they have a prototype of EUV printer, which was believed that only ASML possesses this technology. And the Americans obviously are trying to produce and process critical minerals on their own soil. The Europeans also are trying to do this, maybe with less money and less successfully. So do you think that we are going to be split into different regions that are, let's say, self-sufficient to some extent?
So look, the fact that we've had rapidly proliferating economic warfare over the last 2 decades, and really, again, the story that I tell in my book, Chokepoints, I do think it's driven by a structural issue, again, which is that we have massive economic interdependence to this day. But given that we have geopolitical competition, we've all lost our sense of economic security. This is a framework I come out with in my book called the Geoeconomic Impossible Trinity, in which economic security, economic interdependence, and geopolitical competition, you can only really have 2 out of 3 at the same time. And so right now, we have economic interdependence and we have geopolitical competition, so we don't have a sense of economic security. So in terms of what that means, I don't think politically it's viable in any of the countries you mentioned to lack economic security. It's why in the European Union, economic security is such a high priority. It's why it's such a high priority in the US, in Russia, in China, in Japan. In every major country right now, economic security is the hot topic. And so what does that mean? It means exactly what you said. China trying to indigenize its entire semiconductor industry. The US and Europe trying to indigenize their critical minerals supply chains. And so I do think that we are heading toward a fundamentally different global economy. It's a process that's not happening overnight. It's happening relatively gradually, to the point where if you were to fall asleep today and wake up a year from now, and we were to have this conversation, we'd say, well, not much has changed. But I think if you were to fall asleep today and wake up in 2035, the world would look fundamentally different. In terms of what the new economy will look like, I think a lot of it comes down to the choices of policymakers, particularly in the biggest players in the world, like in Washington, Beijing, and Brussels. Because there is a world where we may move toward a block-based economy, where the US and Europe and other advanced industrial democracies retain significant interdependence amongst each other, but have less interdependence with China and Russia. Basically, you split the world between a big democratic bloc and an authoritarian bloc, right? The thing is, though, I don't think that happens organically. You need leadership, right? You need, particularly the US, the most powerful country in the world still, to actually plant a flag and say, this is what you're trying to build. I think right now, the direction that the Trump administration has been going over the last year has looked more like every nation for itself, right? It's trying to get the single best deal they can with every single individual country. And I think the challenge there is it doesn't build anything like a cohesive bloc. What it does is it makes everyone kind of doubt the trustworthiness of the United States and seek to hedge against it. And I think if you do move into a world where it's more like every nation for itself, and there's not a big economic bloc that the US and Europe can lead together, that's a dangerous world. And it's not just a dangerous world because it's bad for economic growth, and I think will facilitate slower economic growth, the rise of right-wing populist parties. But I think that it will also, and this is the thing I worry about even more, is that it will facilitate and make it more likely that you have great power war. Because what history shows is that when countries don't feel confident that they can secure markets and resources through open trade, they're tempted toward imperialism and conquest. And so that's the thing that I worry about primarily if we're moving towards sort of an every nation for itself type of a world.
So if you're saying, if I'm not mistaken, that this kind of policy leading towards blocks that are, let's say, self-sufficient and competing with each other, it can lead to a global war. So how can we stop it? Do you have any ideas what kind of economic system we can propose that will be better than the direction that we are going to right now?
Yeah, so to be clear, I think it's more every nation for itself. If we don't have blocks, I think that's what makes war more likely. I actually think if you could build a big economic bloc around the US, Europe, and allies, basically the G7 as a core, plus countries like Brazil, India, and some countries in the Gulf and other democracies in the Indo-Pacific, I think you actually could have a more peaceful environment, because I think there's a lot of tension that's built from the fact that we are so dependent on China. I know right now in Europe, there's a lot of tension being built by deindustrialization by China. The fact that big industries like the German car industry are being totally wiped out by cheap Chinese exports, by Chinese overcapacity. That's not sustainable, right? So I actually think that you could get to a good modus vivendi between the West and China if you were to build that bloc. I think this is kind of something where I disagree with a lot of mainstream economic thinking. You know, the IMF, when they talk about economic blocs, they talk about it as a negative thing. Like, this is really bad. Well, I mean, if you look at the Cold War system, right, there was a lot of interdependence between the OECD, but there wasn't very much interdependence between, the West and the Soviet bloc, right? I think that's actually not a bad outcome if we can get there with China. Of course, you want to retain some interdependence, right? Personally, as an American, if I'm importing my T-shirts or my office furniture from China, that's not a problem. I'm okay with that, right? The thing I don't want is to be completely dependent on China for my pharmaceuticals, for the materials I need for military readiness, like drones, for my electric vehicles. So I think you have to be disciplined about what's sort of in the what's okay to be interdependent, what's not okay. But I think more to the point, this will require real work with allies, right? You can't build such a bloc if your allies don't trust you. And so I think that's one thing where I think we will need leadership in the US and Europe and in Asia to get to this point.
So what policy would you suggest to America actually as a natural leader of this probable Western bloc? Because as you mentioned before, right now we see tariffs imposed by the current administration, and I think many countries in the West, broadly speaking, are actually aligning with Donald Trump and his demands. For example, TSMC from Taiwan is investing billions of dollars in the US, but at the same time they're saying they are not going to build the highly advanced, the most advanced semiconductors there. They want to keep the technology, and there are many other examples of countries doing this. So if this is not the correct strategy, so what strategy would be successful in building such a bloc?
Look, I am critical of the Trump administration for whacking allies with tariffs. I don't think that the trade war with Europe or with Japan or Korea have done many favors for the United States. Because I don't know about you, Eugenios, but when I travel to these countries, maybe the politicians in public will say, oh, this is a great deal we got with the United States. Thank you, Donald Trump. But you talk to political leaders and business leaders behind closed doors, and they say, we don't trust the United States. We need to find a way not to be so dependent on them. And they look at what China was able to do, where China did not concede to Trump's demands. They struck back and they achieved some level of deterrence against the US. And I think there's a lot of admiration for how China sort of handled Trump's pressure. And frankly, some admiration by how Modi and Lula, the leaders of India and Brazil, have handled it, where they also have not been cowed by Trump. They've sort of carried on and found ways to sort of lessen the impact of tariffs over time. And so I don't think that we have won ourselves, the United States has won ourselves any favors with the trade wars against Europe, Japan, and Korea. I think that in terms of how you build that bloc, I think it's challenging to do in one fell swoop. Like the idea of, calling a big conference and saying, everyone come to Washington, here's our bloc. I don't think that's how it's going to work. I think it's choosing discrete projects that you can work on together that are really important. And so one area where I am actually more favorable toward what Trump has done is on critical minerals, because we've all seen our vulnerability to Chinese export controls on rare earths. And Trump has both made very substantial domestic investments in rare earth capacity in the US through companies like MP Materials and Vulcan Elements, but his administration has been working with allies to try to build some resilience, including in the context of the G7, which is important, especially because Canada is a massive mining country, and they're having that capacity is very helpful. So I think it's choosing discrete problems like minerals, like pharmaceuticals. I think would be a good one, like semiconductors, where and pack silica, there's a new initiative from the State Department on semiconductors that I think could be a foundation for this on semiconductors. I think choosing these discrete issue areas where we do want to sort of deepen our own interdependence is going to be kind of the building blocks. It's not going to be a Bretton Woods style giant system that's built in one conference or something. I think it's choosing real problems, solving them, showing our people, frankly, showing our democratic populaces that we can actually solve problems together, and then building momentum like that over time. So I think it's really a 5 to 10 year project.
And do you think that the vision that China promotes is something attractive for some Western countries? Because we see countries like Hungary, for example, that invites Chinese, let's say, car manufacturers on its soil to build factories to sell cars in the European Union. We also know that the German economy is strongly dependent on the Chinese market and Chinese products delivered to Europe. So do you think that the Chinese will actually allow this bloc to materialize and maybe offer something different, something more attractive to some Western allies?
Of course, I think working with China is highly attractive. China didn't force us to buy their cheap goods, right? We bought them because they're reliable, they're inexpensive, right? Cheap goods may be problematic for manufacturers in the West, but you know who they're good for? Consumers, right? Consumers like buying inexpensive products, right? I'd rather buy a $20 appliance than a $100 appliance, especially if they're the same quality, right?
Yeah, I think half of the objects in my room actually are from China, so
of course
it says something, yeah.
Yeah. So look, I think that China has a lot to offer, and I want to be clear. I don't think that the world that we should be heading into is one where we're not buying anything from China. That's crazy, right? The U.S. right now has a $600 billion a year trade relationship with China, and I think we saw in April of 2025 when Trump imposed embargo level tariffs on China, 145% tariffs. That is not politically sustainable in the U.S., right? The stock market crashed, and there was talks of a recession right away. So I think it's more of defining this word economic security more rigorously, really deciding what are the areas where we can afford interdependence. I would posit military sensitive technologies, very important industrial products, pharmaceuticals. Those are just to name a few. And then, of course, anything where China has choke point leverage, anything where they can use as a weapon of economic coercion against us, and really focusing on those areas. I think that's the way that we go into. And I think there are going to be many countries in the world that just refuse to choose, right? That are saying, well, I'm not going to be forced into a Western-led bloc or a China-led bloc, and they'll play both sides. And I think that's totally fine. So I don't think the U.S. and Europe will do ourselves any favors if we go to the developing world and say, you can't do business with China. I think it's more about, can we build a project amongst our closest allies that builds a vision of prosperity for the 21st century? We have not succeeded at doing that so far.
And I have also a question regarding the previous topic we were discussing, the probable Western bloc in terms of economic cooperation, because you mentioned also sensitive technologies like defense technologies, for example. And many experts, they believe it's very hard for the West to be fully independent in this sector from China, because rare earth materials are also used in high-tech defense products like F-35s, for example. So how long would it take for America, for other Western countries to be fully independent in these terms from China? Because this is something very important in Poland, because we order fighter jets from America, other weapon systems, and we are in the situation where our security is not sure. So this is something that really bothers us.
Yeah. Do you mean on rare earths or across all the sensitive technologies?
Mostly rare earth. I think this is something that is widely discussed, because if American industry is dependent on China and there is a coercion between these two countries, and we order weapons from America, so those deliveries may be delayed and so on. So this is something very important. Yeah.
Yeah. No. So look, I think that in the sort of realm of choke points, and maybe I'll give you a framework before I answer your question specifically. What is it that makes a choke point? So I think this is important. There are really three criteria. One is market dominance and concentration. Ideally, you want to have at least 80% if not more, in terms of market share. So like I mentioned, the dollar, 90% of all foreign exchange transactions, check, right? ASML, 100% of all EV machines, check. China, 90% of refined rare earths. Okay, they've got market dominance, right? Second criteria, how substitutable is it? You want it to be difficult to substitute, right? China was making 100% of the world's medical masks in 2020, and we all panicked when we didn't have N95 masks in the US, but it lasted a month because it's extremely easy to substitute. You and I could quit our jobs right now and start a medical mask company, and we'd be up and running within a month, right? It's not super hard.
It doesn't work this way with rare earth materials, right?
Exactly. So rare earth materials are a lot more difficult to substitute. What I would say, though, is are they impossible to substitute? No, they're much easier to substitute than ASML's EUV machines or the dollar, right? The reason we know is in the 90s, the US was the main producer of these rare earth minerals. So it doesn't take, there's no like proprietary scientific knowledge that you need to do this. It's really, do you have the capital? Do you have the political will? Are you willing to deal with the environmental problems that come with it? But if you can overcome those hurdles, you could substitute these rare earths within 3 years, for sure. And maybe even sooner if you actually do work with allies, right? If you were willing to not just try to do this domestically in the US, but say, we're going to work with the rest of the G7, with Canada, with the EU, probably with other countries, with other friendly countries, maybe even Ukraine, we could do this much faster, I think, maybe within a couple of years. I think if you don't have that government support, it'll never get done, right? Because the key thing about rare earths is it's a strategically important industry, but it's a terrible business. It's a single-digit billion-dollar revenue a year business. And the margins are terrible. It's very, very thin margins. There's a reason why Western capital, people who could invest in more lucrative opportunities in Poland or the United States are not investing in these businesses. So you need governments to do it. The third characteristic of a choke point, just before I finish, is can you weaponize it asymmetrically? Can you impose more harm on your adversary than you do on yourself? Rare earths definitely fit that mold, right? Because China, like I just said, this is not a big industry. So, if they cut off the US from rare earths, it's terrible for American factories that depend on it, but it's not going to do anything to the Chinese economy. So I think the key here is substitution. I do think we'll be able to do it, but it's going to take political will. And frankly, it's going to take friendshoring more so than onshoring.
So for sure, there's political will in America to produce those minerals on American soil, because you mentioned MP materials. And actually, the government of the United States bought some stakes in this company recently. But do you think the Americans will find political will to cooperate with allied countries, with friends, to do the friendshoring, as you said? Do you think that this is possible? Maybe right now it can be hard, but in the nearest future, what do you think?
I'm cautiously optimistic because I think that I don't think, for maybe one quick thing, I don't think Trump is ever going to work with allies the way previous US presidents have. He doesn't think in the term of alliances, right? He's always looking at relationships as, opportunistic, how much he can get in the moment. But the reason I'm still cautiously optimistic about rare earths is, at least in the US, the Chinese export controls that they did earlier this year were a real shock, right? I mean, they shut down factories within a few weeks. And so I think it freaked out the White House. I think it frightened President Trump and his advisors. And so even if they don't have the same reflexive tendency to work with allies, I think this is probably the one area where they might actually see that it's in their self-interest to work with allies to get it done. And look, Scott Bessent, the Treasury Secretary, has publicly said that we can break this Chinese choke point in 2 to 3 years. So that's an ambitious goal, and I don't think you're doing that without working with allies.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so maybe we can switch to Russia, because this is something that is very important in Poland as well. Recently, the administration of Donald Trump has introduced some sanctions on top Russian oil producers. And in general, as you said, American government is using dollar as an asset, as something that can be an adversary can be deprived of. So, but still, we don't see Russian economy collapsing or Russians stopping waging the war or showing some will to be more subjected to the United States. So, why is it so? what makes the Russian economy so resilient?
So look, I think that economic statecraft, sanctions, particularly when it's wielded by a country that possesses significant choke points, like the United States, does have the power to inflict significant economic harm on other countries. And for sure, the economic harm inflicted on Russia is very material. I think the challenge with evaluating it is you don't have we don't know exactly where Russia's economy would be if there were no sanctions. But I think it's a very good bet, or a very reasonable bet, that Russia's economy would be growing robustly without sanctions, right? Generally speaking, wartime economies with heavy government spending, et cetera, are growing very robustly. Well, this year, 2025, Russia's economy is not growing at all. 0% growth effectively. And they have very high inflation to the point where they've needed to have interest rates in the 20s and high teens now for several years. So, I mean, Russia's in a very dire position economically. So I think sanctions have accomplished quite a bit. I think that in order to cause economic collapse in a place like Russia, you would have needed to do much more aggressive sanctions, because from the very beginning of the sanctions campaign in 2022, at the time, Joe Biden and the US government was very worried about sanctioning the key sector of Russia's economy, which is the oil sector. And so even though we maximize sanctions on banks, Sberbank and VTB, the biggest banks in Russia, were sanctioned right after the war started. The Central Bank of Russia was sanctioned right after the war started. Export controls were put on technologies right after the war started. But we haven't sanctioned Rosneft until 2 months ago, right? I mean, this just goes to show how nervous American officials have been about doing anything that might reduce the flow of oil to global markets and maybe spiking gasoline prices in the United States and inflation. So this has been about minimizing domestic harm in the US. I think had we been a little bit more courageous, which I think we should have been, so I'm critical of the Biden administration's approach, I think we could have sent Russia into a much more dramatic economic crisis, both in 2022 and in an ongoing way. Do I think that that would have ended the war? Probably not. And I think this is another point, which is that just because sanctions can affect significant economic harm doesn't mean that they're a magic bullet. They don't always achieve what you want politically. We're seeing that in Venezuela. Look, sanctions over the last decade have sowed incredible havoc across Venezuela's economy. They've been an economic freefall, hyperinflation now for many years. Hasn't pushed Maduro out of power, and now it looks like the U.S. might go to war with Venezuela to do that. So I think it's important to respect the power of economic warfare and sanctions, but it's also important to understand and appreciate its limitations. And I think when it comes to Russia, we really should be viewing sanctions mostly as a tool of attrition. We should be viewing it as the fact that Putin is our adversary, that he is hell-bent on rebuilding the Russian Empire. There's not much we can do to change his mind. But what we can do is that we can weaken the tools he has at his disposal to fight against us.
So can you envisage more tools the American government can use against Russia? Because last Monday, the decision makers and negotiators from America, from Ukraine, from European countries, they met in Berlin, and everybody came out of this meeting very happy. Each side was saying that these negotiations were very successful, and what media reported is right now we need to actually see what Russia says about it. And so when there is some kind of consensus, but Russia doesn't want to agree, do you think that America can do more in terms of sanctions or other means of pressure, and should use them against Russia to force it to stop the war?
Yes. Yeah, we are too weak on Russia sanctions. We have been for years, right? Biden was too weak on Russia sanctions, and Trump has been way too weak, right? I mean, to his credit, the Rosneft and Lukoil sanctions were a good step. Those are the only two sanctions he's done in the entire year, right? During the Biden administration, we had a full new package of sanctions every single week, right? I mean, the EU's got 19 packages of sanctions. Well, during the Biden administration, there were like I said, a new package of sanctions every single week. There's about 140 packages in a 3-year period, right? So we need to significantly up the pressure and the tempo of the campaign against Russia. The challenge is, and this is a big challenge, especially for countries like Poland that really care about this problem, is it doesn't seem like President Trump really views Russia as a threat. And so that's a problem, because even though there are people around Trump, I think like the Secretary of State, Marco Rubio, who are more clear-eyed about the Russian threat, Trump, for whatever reason, has this, maybe rose-tinted glasses when it comes to dealing with Putin. And so if I were the Europeans, I wouldn't wait around hoping that Trump is going to see the light. I would be stepping up the pressure myself. That's why right now, what's happening right now in Brussels, the decision about potentially seizing Russia's sovereign assets and repurposing them for Ukraine is so important, because that is a step that Europe can take by itself. It doesn't need Donald Trump to say, okay, they can just go ahead and do it, and they should. And after that, the Europeans should also lead the way in terms of upping pressure on Russia, something that I think doesn't get talked about enough. Yes, Trump did these sanctions against Rosneft and Lukoil, but guess what? This summer, months before that, the EU imposed sanctions on Indian oil refineries and Chinese banks for supporting Russia. And before Trump did these sanctions, the UK imposed sanctions on Rosneft and Lukoil. What that shows is that it's actually Europe and the UK together, and Canada for that matter, who can be leading. You could push the envelope, and maybe it becomes easier for Trump to okay and green light a sanction if they say, oh, well, the US is just catching up to where the EU and the UK and Canada already are.
Yeah, I think right now when we are talking, actually the European decision makers, they are talking about seizing the Russian assets. Let's see what was going to be the result of those talks, because it's very important and very interesting for us, especially in Poland. But you mentioned the approach that Donald Trump has towards Russia. You mentioned the glasses. Some people here in Poland, many analysts, they believe there is a pragmatic reason. Actually, Donald Trump and his administration, and previous administrations maybe as well, they don't want Russia to be like a junior partner of China. And this is what's happening actually right now, because Russia is weakening when it's waging the war against Ukraine. It's getting weaker and more dependent on China. It has to sell, let's say, oil and gas to China very cheaply, because there is no other market they can do it. So do you think this is really going on, that Russia is getting more dependent on China, and this is a threat for the US, and this is perceived as a threat by the current administration?
Yes, Russia is certainly becoming more dependent on China. They're effectively a Chinese vassal state, right? I mean, the Russian, talk about the Russian economic collapse. If China were to do anything to cut off to Russia, they would be totally isolated. They would be North Korea, on the Volga, right? It would be a totally different situation. China has been sort of the white knight coming to Russia's rescue. I think there's a question that we should ask, though. Is there anything we can do about it on the Russian side, right? Could we actually peel Russia away from China? I don't know your perspective. And look, whenever I'm talking to Poles, I tend to be fairly deferential. You guys know Russia better than we do in the US. My own take, though, is it's very, very unlikely that you're going to peel Putin away from China.
I think nobody believes in reverse Kissinger or reverse Nixon, but I think some people, they believe that Americans want to make some economic ties with Russia, so to give Russia options, so they have more options than only China and maybe to some extent India, right?
Yeah, look, so I do think that there are some people in the Trump administration who think the reverse Nixon is viable, and I've always thought it was crazy. I think to the extent you're going to peel either side away, which I think is going to be hard, given that there is this symbiotic relationship, it's more likely that you could peel China away. That basically you could, because to this day, I mean, China's economic relationship, even just with Europe, forget the United States, China's economic relationship with Europe is way more important, order of magnitude more important to China than its economic relationship with Russia. So what would happen if Europe and the US actually went to China and said, if you don't stop supporting Russia's military industrial complex, we are going to impose significant economic pain on you, China? I think the Chinese would stop. We have not had the courage in the West to do that. And that's the fault of our leaders. But we have the power. We have the power to peel China away, not by persuading the heart, Xi Jinping in his heart. It's by hitting his wallet, because he depends on us way more than he needs China, or Russia, rather.
Well, I think this is how this is presented in Poland, that actually Germany doesn't want to impose harsh measures on China because they are still dependent on the Chinese market. So yes, the European Union, it introduced some tariffs on Chinese electric vehicles, for example, but they are way lower than 100% introduced by America and Canada, right? So do you think that this is something that might block European Union from doing this, what you're saying?
Yeah, look, I think the Germans, as you know better again than I do, although I've worked with German diplomats when I was in government, they're always very slow. They're always very cautious. They're always very legalistic. What I will say is that I've been impressed by Chancellor Merz's courage and leadership. Look what he's doing right now in Brussels. He is the one trying basically to push this reparation loan across the finish
completely
line.
different than his predecessor, like Olaf Scholz, yeah.
Yeah, I'm different from Angela Merkel as well, right? I mean, he is leading in a way that I've not seen a German chancellor lead in decades. And so let's see what happens with the reparation loan. But look, maybe Merz will also see the light on China too. I think that the challenge with the European approach on China is that they don't have the right partner in the U.S., right? And that I don't believe that Donald Trump agrees with what I'm saying. Like, I think the idea that you could have the U.S. and Europe go to China and give them an ultimatum about Russia, I think that would work, but I don't think Trump would be on board for that. Trump wants a trade deal with China. He likes Putin. He doesn't want to impose more pressure on Putin. So, could Europe do it by itself? Could Europe and the UK and Canada, apply some pressure on China to try to get them to cut their ties with Russia? Maybe you can get the Trump administration on board if Putin is seen as the obstacle to peace. I think that's maybe the best hope, because Trump obviously wants this peace deal to sort of another feather in his cap and another line in his Nobel Prize application for 2026. And so maybe if Putin looks like he's obstinate, and it seems like Zelensky's been playing this very well, maybe then that's an opportunity. But I don't think Trump's going to be the one who comes up with the idea. It's going to take leaders from places like Poland and Germany and the UK and Canada and maybe Finland, because we know that Mr. Stubb has some influence on Trump. It's going to take them coming up with these plans and then trying to get Trump to come along.
My last question is about India, because you also mentioned India. What stance India will take in this, let's say, global competition and shaping of new global economic order? Because the Indians I think that they are a puzzle for Western people, because on one hand, they are in BRICS format against the West. They are also in Quad format against China. And they are buying Russian oil, but at the same time, they perceive this or show themselves as the representatives of global South, the people who are, let's say, underdogs. So what stance India might take in the future?
So I agree that India is a puzzle for Western analysts. I'm lucky in that my in-laws are from India, so I feel like I have a little bit of a better perspective on things there. And I think that there's a strong tradition of non-alignment where there's a proud independence. They don't view alliances the same way that we do in the US or Europe, where for us, like if you're working in foreign policy, alliances are sort of the core, right? Like that's what you're focused on. India doesn't do that, right? They say they like to be independent. There's this view that why can't we do all of these things at once? And they certainly don't like being bullied. And I think that the Trump administration really miscalculated in August, because the big tariffs that were put on India really did alienate a lot of people in India and made them question the drift that's been happening. I mean, it's taken decades, right? I mean, it's been the work of 4 or 5 different US presidents to try to bring India closer into the US orbit. And I think that's been largely successful, even getting India into a format like the Quad, doing more defense partnerships with India against China. But I think that we've taken a big step back in the last few months, because there's a lot of trust that's been lost. So I don't think India is necessarily ever going to be an ally of the United States the way that NATO allies are. But I do think that doesn't mean we shouldn't bring them in as an important voice in our forums, because I think the other thing about India is if they're treated with respect, which they should be, right? I mean, they're about to be the 3rd largest economy in the world. They're the biggest country in the world by population, and they're growing faster than any of us. If we do give them the respect and the seat at the table, I think culturally and in terms of norms and values, they are much closer to us than they are to China or Russia. And so I think that we have to tolerate a little bit of leakage, a little bit of behavior that we wouldn't want to see. In terms of either their defense relationship with Russia or some of their dealings with China. But I think that doesn't mean that we should give up on India.
Thank you very much for this very insightful, very interesting interview. That was really a pleasure to listen to your answers. So thank you again.
It's my pleasure. And the one final thing I just want to say is I've traveled to Poland many times, and I've always been incredibly impressed by the level of knowledge on geopolitics and foreign policy in Poland. And so it's a real honor that Chokepoints is being published there. And I look forward to hopefully coming to Poland soon to have more conversations about the book.
Yeah, you're kindly invited to come to Poland. Hope we can meet in person and also conduct an interview about the book, because it's very worth recommending. So thank you again. And I recommend to our viewers again the book by Professor Edward Fishman, Chokepoints, American Power in the Age of Economic Warfare. And this book was published in Poland by Prześwity Publishing House. Thank you very much.
Subskrybuj nasz kanał. Znajdziesz tu wiele ciekawych audycji, wnikliwych komentarzy i wywiadów z najlepszymi polskimi oraz zagranicznymi ekspertami.